Welcome back to The Way, the Truth, the podcast. I'm your host, Brian Smith, and I come to you today not only as a believer, but as a clinical professional. For 40 years, I have worked at the bedside of broken human bodies. I have held hands in trauma bays. I have assessed wounds. I have watched the human body fight to survive. I hold a doctorate of nursing practice, and I have spent my career understanding in exquisite clinical detail what trauma does to flesh and blood and bone. And I need to tell you, nothing in 40 years of nursing has prepared me to fully comprehend what happened to Jesus of Nazareth in the final 18 hours of his earthly life. Today I want to walk with you, slowly, reverently, and honestly, through the medical and physical reality of what Jesus endured. Not to sensationalize, not to shock, but because I believe the church has sometimes been too polite about the suffering of Christ. The scriptures are not polite about it. Isaiah 52:14 says his appearance was so disfigured beyond that of any human being that people were horrified to look at him. That is a clinical statement as much as it is a prophetic one. Let us honor it as both. It begins in a garden, the Garden of Gethsemane, on the western slope of the Mount of Olives. Luke 22:44 gives us one of the most medically remarkable verses in all of Scripture. It reads, "And being in anguish, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat was like drops of blood falling to the ground." Now, a casual reader might take that as a metaphor. I do not. Because what Luke, himself a physician, is describing has a name in modern medicine. It is called hematidrosis. It is rare. It occurs under conditions of catastrophic physiological and psychological stress. What happens is this. The extreme anxiety causes the small capillary blood vessels surrounding the scalp and skin to rupture. Blood literally seeps into the sweat ducts and is excreted through the skin. The resulting appearance is exactly what Luke records: sweat that is like blood, tinged, heavy, and red. The clinical consequences of hematidrosis are significant. The skin becomes extremely fragile, hypersensitive, and tender to touch. Every nerve ending is raw. The body's stress response has been in full cascade. Cortisol floods the bloodstream. Blood pressure is elevated. The heart rate is elevated. And here is what strikes me as a clinician. Jesus had not yet been touched by a single soldier's hand when this occurred. The trauma began in prayer. It began in the full and conscious weight of what he was choosing to carry, the sin of humanity, pressing down upon a human nervous system that he had chosen to inhabit fully. He was already wounded before the first blow landed. He was likely sleep deprived from the emotional weight of that final week. He had eaten his last supper hours earlier, but given what was to come, he was already entering the physiological state of a patient about to be destroyed. Approximately midnight, Judas led an armed cohort into the garden. Jesus was seized. What followed was, in clinical language, a sustained period of compounded physiological insult. He was bound, marched across Jerusalem, roughly 1 mile, to the house of the high priest Caiaphas. He stood through the night. The scriptures tell us he was tried before the Sanhedrin through hours of darkness, before Pilate, before Herod, and back to Pilate again. There was no brief encounter. It was hours of standing, interrogation, humiliation, and deliberate degradation. Mark 14:65 records, "Then some began to spit at him. They blindfolded him, struck him with their fists, and said, 'Prophesy.' And the guards took him and beat him." Let me be precise about what is happening here medically. The fist to the face. We are talking about blunt force trauma in the orbital region, the nose, the jaw, the cheekbones. This produces facial contusions, possibly orbital fractures, epistaxis, nosebleeds. The repeated strikes to the head create the clinical picture consistent with a traumatic brain injury, what we today call a concussion, or in multiple blows, a grade 2 to 3 traumatic brain injury. We are talking about neurological symptoms, disorientation, photosensitivity, nausea, impaired balance. Jesus was likely concussed before he was ever flogged. The spitting. In Jewish culture, it's an act of maximum contempt. Numbers 12:14 and Deuteronomy 25:9. Spitting on a person was not merely disgusting. It was a declaration that you were considered someone subhuman. The Son of God, the Word made flesh, received the spit of men he himself had formed from the dust. And he had not slept. He had not been permitted rest. He had stood through a night trial. Medically, acute sleep deprivation compounds neurological injury, impairs pain processing, amplifies emotional and physiological suffering. He was dehydrated. He had sweated blood. There were no IV fluids, no pain management. Now we come to what may be, by clinical measure, the single most devastating event of the Passion, the Roman scourging. John 19:1 simply reads, "Then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged." The scriptures give it one verse. I want to give it the gravity it deserves. The Roman flagrum, the instrument of scourging. It was not a simple whip. It was a short wooden handle with multiple leather thongs, each embedded at intervals with pieces of iron, bone, or lead. The Romans called these bumpatai, leaded tips. The instrument was engineered specifically to maximize tissue destruction. The prisoner was stripped, bound to a post, and beaten, typically by 2 Roman soldiers called lictors, alternating strikes, one on each side. Jewish law capped flogging at 40 lashes, but the Romans had no such limit. Historical records and the physical evidence of the Shroud of Turin both suggest Jesus received somewhere between 39 and 60 lashes. Now, what does each strike of a Roman flagrum actually do to a human body? The initial lashes cut through the skin, the dermis and the epidermis. But with subsequent strokes, the leaded tips begin to tear into the subcutaneous fat layer, then into the muscle fascia underneath. By later stages of scourging, the wounds are no longer lacerations. They are avulsions, meaning strips and chunks of muscle are being pulled away from the body. The back, the shoulders, the buttocks, the backs of the legs all become an open, hemorrhaging wound field. The blood loss alone would place Jesus in what we classify as a Class 2 to Class 3 hemorrhagic shock, meaning he had lost somewhere between 15 and 40% of his blood volume. In an ICU trauma bay today, that patient would get 2 large bore IVs, aggressive crystalloid resuscitation, likely packed red blood cells, and an immediate surgical consult. He gets a trauma activation. Jesus got a purple robe thrown over those open wounds, which would have adhered immediately to the bleeding flesh, and a crown of thorns pressed into his scalp. The scalp is one of the most vascularly rich regions of the human body. The thorns, likely from the Zipius spina crista plant, with spines up to 1 inch long, driven into the dense fibrous tissue over the skull, potentially reaching the pericranium. The bleeding from scalp wounds is profuse. It is dramatic. And combined with the scourging, his face and head were, as Isaiah prophesied, nearly unrecognizable. They placed the crossbeam on his back. Not the full cross. Roman prisoners typically carried the horizontal beam, which weighed between 75 and 125 pounds. This was laid across the shoulders and upper back of a man already in hemorrhagic shock, whose back was an open wound, who had a traumatic brain injury, who had not slept, who had not had adequate fluids in over 18 hours. The distance from Pilate's Praetorium to Golgotha, the hill of the skull, was approximately 650 meters. That's roughly a third of a mile. On cobblestone, uphill. He did fall. The Gospels record Simon of Cyrene being conscripted to carry the cross. A clinical detail, not a theological accident. Jesus could no longer bear the weight. His cardiovascular system was compensating at maximum. His muscles were oxygen deprived. His blood pressure was dropping. Each fall onto cobblestone with hands bound drove additional trauma to his knees, forearms, and the already catastrophic wound on his back. Luke 23:28 records him speaking to the women of Jerusalem on this walk. He was conscious through all of this. His mind was present. That, to me as a clinician, is almost as remarkable as anything else. Crucifixion was not invented by the Romans, but they perfected it as an instrument of public, prolonged, agonizing death. It was so horrific that Roman law prohibited its use on Roman citizens. It was reserved for slaves, criminals, and enemies of the state. And now I come to the nails. Modern forensic archaeology, particularly the 1968 discovery of crucifixion victim Yehohanan in Jerusalem, confirms that the nails were driven through the wrists, not the palms. The Greek word used in the Gospels encompasses the wrist. A nail through the palm cannot support body weight. The tissue tears. The nail was driven through the space between the radius and the ulna, directly through the median nerve, the largest sensory nerve in the wrist. When a nail transects or compresses the median nerve, the resulting pain is called cossalgia, a burning, electric, unbearable neuropathic pain that radiates up the arm into the shoulder and chest. Every movement, every breath, electric fire, up both arms continuously. The feet were nailed through the second metatarsal space, pinning them to the upright beam. And now the dying sequence begins. Let me describe this carefully, because this is where the body's physiology tells the story of the cross. In crucifixion, the body hangs by the arms. This position forces the chest muscles into a fixed inhalation posture. The diaphragm becomes mechanically disadvantaged. Breathing in is possible, passive, gravity-assisted. Breathing out is nearly impossible without pushing up on the nailed feet. So the crucified person does this. They push up through the nailed feet, driving the nail deeper into the metatarsal bones to raise the body enough to exhale. Then they collapse back down. They push up again to exhale. Every breath is a choice to inflict further pain upon themselves. This cycle causes a cascade of systemic failure. The lungs develop hypercapnia. Carbon dioxide accumulates in the blood as ventilation becomes inadequate. Respiratory acidosis sets in. The blood pH drops. The heart, already stressed from hemorrhagic shock, must now compensate for falling oxygen, rising acidity, and profound hypotension. The heart rate climbs. Arrhythmias become likely. The pericardium, the sac surrounding the heart, may begin to fill with fluid, a condition called pericardial effusion. The kidneys begin to fail. Acute tubular necrosis. In the ICU, this patient is on a ventilator with a Foley catheter monitoring urine output that is falling toward zero. The brain, already concussed, already oxygen deprived, is now hypoxic. Cerebral hypoxia produces a clinical picture of agitation, then loss of consciousness. The muscles, particularly in the chest wall and arms, begin rhabdomyolysis. The breakdown of muscle tissue releases myoglobin into an already falling bloodstream. Death by crucifixion is, at its core, death by asphyxiation, compounded by hemorrhagic shock, cardiac failure, and multi-organ dysfunction. In our modern trauma and critical care system, this patient requires a trauma surgeon, a cardiothoracic surgeon, a nephrologist, a neurointensivist, a hematologist, and a full ICU team with every pharmacological and mechanical intervention available to man. John 19:34 records that when the soldiers pierced Jesus' side with a spear, blood and water came out. This is not symbolic embellishment. This is a clinical sign. The most probable explanation is a hemothorax. When that spear was thrust upward into the right side, it released both accumulated blood and serous fluid. John, who witnessed this, recorded what he saw precisely. He did not understand it medically, but he saw it accurately. He had been on the cross for 6 hours. He had arrived in hemorrhagic shock. He died as he chose to die, as a human being, with every system of his body subjected to the full weight of biological mortality. Now I want to pause here in this clinical wilderness and say something I believe with every credential and every year of experience I possess. Jesus did not have to do this. Matthew 26:53, Jesus said to Peter in the garden, "Do you think I cannot call on my Father, and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels?" A Roman legion numbered 6,000 soldiers. 12 legions, that's 72,000 angels, celestial beings before whom Roman soldiers would have been made as dust. They were ready, assembled, and waiting. But Jesus said no. And I want you to understand what that means physiologically. Every nerve that fired, every lash of the flagrum, every nail, every agonizing push-up on torn feet just to exhale one breath, he felt all of it. Hebrews 4:15 tells us he was tempted in every way, just as we are. He took on human flesh in its complete fragility, and he did not numb it. He did not suspend his nervous system. He did not withdraw from the pain. He bore it consciously, deliberately, for each of us by name. Isaiah 53:5 was written 700 years before that Friday, and it reads like a trauma nurse's report. He was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. As a nurse, I have spent 40 years trying to heal wounds. And I can tell you, some wounds are beyond the reach of medicines. The Apostle Paul wrote in Philippians 2:7 and 8 that Jesus made himself nothing, taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness. He humbled himself and became obedient to death, even death on a cross. The most brutal instrument of execution the ancient world had devised, a death designed to maximize suffering, to humiliate, to break the body publicly, and slowly become the altar of our redemption. I have described to you today the clinical anatomy of a sacrifice, but I want to leave you with this. On the third day, the same body that sustained hematidrosis and hemorrhagic shock and asphyxiation and a spear wound to the thorax rose from the dead, not as a ghost, not as a vision, as a body, with the wounds still visible, still touchable, as Thomas discovered. These wounds are eternal. Revelation 5:6 describes the Lamb in heaven as one who appeared as if slain. He carries those marks forever, the evidence of what love was willing to do. If you are in pain today, if your body is broken, if your heart is crushed, if you feel as though no one could possibly understand what you are enduring, I want you to know that the one who sits at the right hand of the Father has been there, in the most literal, clinical, biological sense. He knows what trauma feels like, and he went through every moment of it for you. This is The Way, the Truth, the podcast. My name is Brian Smith. God bless you, keep you, and heal every wound you carry by the wounds he willingly bore.